my authority as chair and go ahead and get the session started and welcome those who are entering the Zoom space. My name is Mark Thompson. I'm director of the Southeast Asia Research Center. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to our talk today with Dr. Aim Sinpeng, whose talk is on mapping hate speech and disinformation on social media in Southeast Asia. And Aim is a senior lecturer at the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney. And I was jesting with Aim that we've been having a series of speakers, it seems, from Sydney, which is our previous speaker was also from the university, which is because they have a very large and influential Southeast Asia Research Center. Aim is currently a Discovery Early Research Fellow for her project Cyber Repression and Protests in Thailand. Her book, Opposing Democracy in the Digital Age, the University of Michigan Press, came out last year and won an early career book prize from the Asian Studies Association of Australia. She's recently won an early career outstanding researcher award at the University of Sydney and is working on 2 projects on AI and gender bias in Southeast Asia with collaboration from Google and UNESCO, and unpacking bias in social media news in the liberal regimes, which is interestingly funded by Facebook. Aim, again, thanks very much for joining us. We're honored to have you speak to us today about your very topical and important issue that you address here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mark, Diego, and Calvin, and Kevin, for having me here. I hope it's okay that my talk is quite casual. I think I'm working on something that is really difficult and challenging to study because it's new and it's like going to uncharted territory. So a lot of my research experience for the past few years have been largely working with tech companies and to try to sort out or find ways to detect bad content and restore the good on social media again. And today's talk is going to be based on 2 past projects that I've done with Twitter and Meta. And I would like to draw on these 2 projects because it's my way of sort of trying to get at this problem of bad content on social media, which includes disinformation and hate speech as 2 of the most difficult content issues on social media. So I'll just quickly share the screen, and I'm happy to talk about other things like, the issue of AI and what have you, but these are the 2 projects that I've recently finished. Oh, where is it? Let's see. Wait, too many things open. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. So the first project was started in 2020 and pretty much wrapped up within 2 months. The context of the project was really interesting. I received an email one day from the Stanford Internet Observatory, which is one of the most sort of, cutting edge think tank / university research that works on like disinformation and cutting edge issues. And they said, we need to talk to you, but we can't tell you why until you sign a non-disclosure agreement. And I'm like, oh, that's really interesting now. I will sign this NDA, having no idea why. And so I did, and then they said, okay, Twitter has contacted us that they're about to take down nearly 1,000 Twitter accounts that they have identified as being part of disinformation campaign that came out of state agencies in Thailand. We need you on this. They're giving us data that is hatched, which means that has identifiers. Usually you can't get publicly accessible social media data with identifiers anymore. Basically, that comes with identities. And before they do this takedown, they wanted an independent investigation of why these disinformation networks happen. We need you because it's on Thailand. They believe that the entire disinformation campaigns came out of the Thai army. And I was, to be honest, quite scared. Because, I'm one of those academics that are under surveillance. You know what I'm talking about in Hong Kong. So I said, okay, well, this is too important to not do, so let's do it. So we were given 4 weeks to look at like millions of data points and try to make sense of it. And this is sort of the difficulties of understanding and researching disinformation, right? Because disinformation by definition is an intent to mislead others. That's different from misinformation, which is misleading information that is unintentional, right? And the biggest problem in researching disinformation online is always, how do we know the intent of the people who produce the content? If, as social science researchers, we think, okay, to ask for intent, you would have to like interview them. But who was gonna say that they are behind disinformation campaigns? And this is how, I'm gonna explain a little bit. This is how social media companies approach the issue of disinformation, right? So the report that came out was called From Truth to Trolls Inside Thailand's Information Operations. And weirdly enough, before I get this email about this Twitter-Stanford collaboration at all, there had been a leak. It's in a similar manner as a WikiLeaks in Thailand back in 2019 by opposition MPs who said they call it an IO. IO in Thai is short from information operations, information ops, right? And that suggests that it's being created by the state, likely the cyber wing of the military or the cyber police. You guys are definitely familiar with this from Hong Kong perspective. And, opposition MP came, look, we have a leak. Someone inside the military has leaked to us the kind of tasks they were asked to do on social media, propaganda, attacking opposition, yada, yada. And then, they show a few Facebook pages that they believe were part of this disinformation operation on Facebook, and it's to promote positive image of the military. So they went on and on in Parliament, but the problem always is, well, there's no evidence, right? They even try to get someone from the military to speak about this leak because it came, the leak showed official documents, but it's always like he said, she said, there's no evidence. And in highly polarized political conditions like in Thailand, but for the same thing would go for the Philippines. Opposition politicians say something, and if you are pro-government, you immediately dismiss it, right? Oh, that's fake news. So there's no real actual evidence, and Facebook had never come out, at that point to take down or disable any account. So Twitter doing this in 2020 was the very first time a major social media company actually took action against the Thai state for implicating them for disinformation campaign. So this happens with 2019. It became like a big thing in Thailand for a while, but it's basically the information came from the opposition. So it kind of, it was viewed as bias. And interestingly, prior to me taking part in this operation with Twitter, I had conducted interviews with digital media organizations in Thailand. And one question I asked all 15 of them, they were news organization, digital news organization. I asked them, are you being monitored by the government? And all 15 of them said yes, right? So this perception that they live in this constant surveillance by their state is definitely there. And this doesn't surprise us if we look at the context, right, of growing cyber repression all around the world. Southeast Asia it used to be the Philippines, the only country that would be ranked as free according to Freedom House in terms of the freedom on the internet. And now there is none, right? There isn't a single country. You look at Freedom House, Variety of Democracy, same thing. Not a single country in Southeast Asia that has an open internet environment, and much of the repression takes the form of both proactive type of repression, like persecution, jail, detention, intimidation. I had a colleague once who was an academic like me, but in Thailand, who was like going to work, and a van showed up at the university, and he's being, politely called to go into the van with 3 military guys dressed as civilian. And my colleague was like, where am I going? This is during military dictatorship between 2014 to 2019. Where am I going? It's like, well, we just want to chat. But why I have to chat in the van? I said, well, we have to take you somewhere to chat. And they're trying to be polite. And he goes into the van, drove 2 hours outside of Bangkok to go to military camp. He was asked to go in a room. And then he was asked to log on to his Facebook account and scroll through messages from years back to see if he had done anything wrong. Like, this happened a lot. This kind of outright intimidation, harassment, repression, right? It's just picking someone up without a warrant or a cause and say, we want to chat, and make you, they don't even, at that point, you don't even need Facebook to release your personal, to release information. You just go and get someone from their work or their house and force them to open their Facebook account. And look, someone had, there had been people who had gone to prison for violating, a Computer Crime Act for something they had been 5 years prior during the time of democratic government. This is what was happening in Thailand. That's how bad it was. But also more surveillance type of repression, right? So monitoring, tracking down your phone, using softwares to hack your phones. This has been happening lately with Pegasus, which is a software bought from Israel to attack opposition networks, especially with the youth movement in Thailand. So information operations, when people talk about IOs, it's a military term actually that predates the internet. And it means that it's a type of influence operation where you collect data and tactile information about the adversary, and that adversary could be your own citizens, to disseminate propaganda so that you can have competitive advantage over your opponent, which could be the opposition, political opposition, critics, doesn't have to be foreign, right? And it can take the form of disinformation, surveillance, and propaganda, and in some cases, and in many cases that I've looked at, all 3 of them. And social media is a fantastic arena to conduct IOs because it's seen as a force multiplier, because you can do this operation across a number of accounts in real time and across a long period of time, like in series of operations. So it's an easy way to penetrate society, have a better sense of where your opponents are, adversaries are, especially if they're your critics, and gauge your own legitimacy too, like try to gauge how popular you are as a regime and what have you. And in agents of IOs, can be more than this: military, cyber police, cyber parliamentary. It can also be non-state actors. This is what a lot of political parties use, which is, basically contracting them out to PR media companies, digital media marketing companies, basically. So they're called by social media companies as bad actors for hire, because you basically hire digital marketing company or campaign, PR campaign company to do your campaign, but also to do disinformation. And the challenge of studying IO is the data issue. This is the biggest challenge because the data resides with private companies, which are tech companies. So ordinary people, civil society, even government, even researchers in particular, have a hard time accessing data to study how this information works, how IO works, because the data resides with private companies. I think that's the biggest hurdle of all the things to study, is that as researchers, we don't always have access to data. Now access is getting better, the best with Twitter, who that released the most data to researchers, and now Meta is trying to follow along. Attribution, so who did it, is always hard, because it could be done through bots. It could be done through subcontracting outside companies. This was the case a lot with Philippines elections and other Southeast Asian elections, where they used, different subcontractors, both in PR marketing, to help amplify voices online. And it's not always clear who the actual boss are. And then plus you get the issue of influencers, micro-influencers, who are not technically hire or work for politicians, but play a huge part in basically promoting and propagating potentially false information. Before I go back to Twitter, it's really important to understand how social media companies detect disinformation. People think that social media companies their job is to fight against falsehood and restore the authority of truth. But in fact, they don't do that at all, because they can't, because their business model isn't to find facts and to remove false content. The business model is to keep people online. They are not truth saviors. So what they've done is trying to figure out, how do we define this information in ways that we can detect in a large scale and have a global solution to it? So they come up with this concept called coordinated inauthentic behavior, or CIB. And like my slide has, you can just Google CIB, Facebook, and there's a really good short clip by Meta to explain what it is. But essentially, it's about looking at a misleading behavior rather than truthful information. So they define this information as a series of accounts that behave in ways that are misleading. And that justifies them taking those accounts down. How do you become misleading? How is your behavior misleading? For example, you can have false images as your profile images. You can have a location and information about your work that don't align. So for example, you have a picture of a girl, and then your name is Sam, and you're from San Antonio, Texas, but you're posting about life in, Malaysia, and it just doesn't work. Like the content of your postings don't line up with the kind of profile that you use. They can also detect when you use images, because they have image sort of algorithms to look at whether this image has been used across a number of different accounts. So that's one item of misleading information. There's, I've seen two accounts of a very prominent troll in the Philippines that Facebook took down, where basically, the guy is a girl from America, doesn't post anything about America at all, about school, about the kids that she supposedly have, but it's a he. And then the only post this account's ever done is about Duterte. And the same messages that are used to support Duterte appeared in 100 other accounts at around the same time. So they look at all these signals of signatures of coordinated misleading behavior. right, as defined together as disinformation campaign. Twitter does the same, Google does the same on YouTube, TikTok as well. So this is how tech companies actually identify this information. It's not about true or false. It's not about whether information is factual. It's about whether or not you exhibit misleading behavior according to their algorithms. So it's a very different understanding of what it is to fight disinformation. But this is the only data we have access to. Other than as a researcher trying to study this information, it's just one way of looking at it. So in this project, we didn't get to define this information. Twitter defined it for us. They've looked at these accounts and they said, okay, these have these different signatures, like, misleading names, content, the same content that appear across a number of different accounts at the same time. And it appears to come out of these state agencies in Thailand inside the military army, that they have been aware of the existence of cyber police acting as conducting information operations. So all these put together, they decided all these accounts are disinformation campaigns. Then they gave it to us to analyze further. So we didn't get to actually decide if that was disinformation or not. Social media company had already decided that was, and we take it from there. So that's one way of studying disinformation, is to not get into debating what it is, but take it from tech company and say, okay, you have decided this is disinformation, and then let's look at what it is. So in this report, which is available online, we were tasked to look at, who was this IO targeting, how were they organized, what strategies did they employ, and what impacts did they have on society, right? After we clean up the data, it led to about 21,000 tweets from 926 accounts that Twitter had already decided they were about to take down. So we looked at when the accounts were created, and it was very clearly created. Interestingly, the activities were around 2020, right? So late 2019, and throughout much of 2020, that was when all of these youth pro-democracy protesters were out on the street in droves in Thailand, right? So that was the beginning of the 2020 protests, and it kind of started right before that. Some of the accounts that we had, most of the accounts that we had seen had actually been established in 2014, which was when the military coup happened, but there had been no activity at all across these accounts until late 2019, when the protests were starting. And that's so interesting, because if you're in a long-term game of influence operation on social media, you start early and you kind of sow the seeds, right? So you're trying to, if you wanted to create, you want to create support, grassroots support for the military, especially because military dictatorship kind of ends, and then the election happened and they came back to power. But there's a lot of people who hated the military, and they wanted to use social media to prop up support. They should be active throughout much of the time they were in power, but they were not. They just reacted, right? So their campaign was in direct reaction to growing protests in Thailand, rather than, being smart and sort of start early and try to game this by, flooding social media with lots of positive images of military, things that they do really well, or trying to decapacitate the rising dissent against military online early on. But no, they're just very reactionary. We tried to do social network analysis to look at how the accounts were related, and basically from these pretty but difficult to understand graphs, it just shows that much of the activities are concentrated around actual military and government accounts, official accounts, and didn't really go too much engaging with society as a whole. So basically what we found was that they were talking mostly to themselves. They were just like tweeting each other, retweeting each other, rather than trying to get engagement. And this, when we dig further and look at the engagement, which is probably one of the most important indicators for virality, right? How viral the content has gone. We find that the vast majority of their disinformation campaign on Twitter's received, fewer than 3 retweets. They were largely engaging with other government agency and attacking opposition rather than just, you can see like if they're doing a good job with their campaign might get picked up by media institutions or other groups in society, not just within military and police force. They clearly lack sophisticated social media marketing technique, and most of the tweets were very obviously pro-military. And I think this, there are many ways to study social media. And one of the methods that I think is underappreciated is ethnography, digital ethnography, because digital ethnography and qualitative analysis of text. Because when you read the text individually, as opposed to using a software to look at vast amounts of text, you really get to understand how out of touch this campaign was to the digital culture in Thailand. So if you're on Twitter in Thailand, so Twitter is still a very niche platform. Penetration rate is only about 60%, but it's used heavily by academics, journalists, and young people, especially female. And that's because 90% of activity on Twitter in Thailand was about K-pop. So when a military come in trying to do stuff on Twitter, because that's where a lot of young people are, that's where the political opposition has been able to gain significant grounds, because they're no longer focusing on Facebook. They moved into Twitter because there was an open space there. They did not understand that you don't just randomly tweet, you have to get the lingo right. A lot of the words, text used by young people on Twitter, it's like new borrowed slang terms that largely based on K-pop culture, because that 90% of the people on Twitter are into K-pop. So when they see a propaganda from the military, they know it's not them who write this, because it reads like a 50-year-old person wrote this, like it reads like what their parent trying to learn how to use Twitter. They didn't understand the digital culture at all. So no one got the message because it wasn't sexy. It wasn't in a language that Twitter users use. It just went nowhere. For example, a hashtag, soldiers are the foundation of Thailand. Like, who uses that hashtag? No one. Anyone reads that in Thai knows that this is not how. This is like how not to do a Twitter campaign, because young people would just look at this and be like, oh, whatever. Like, I'm never going to retweet this. It's just not happening, right? And so one of the key points I made about information operations is that it has to be done in a context where you really understand the digital culture, especially if you're trying to gain the hearts and minds of young people, that you understand how they talk online, not just, oh, we'll just create a hashtag and hopefully it will go somewhere. Like, no, like, in fact, there were campaigns to sabotage the government Twitter campaigns, because they know it was done by IO. There's no, it's done by the military, because it clearly talks like a military person. And they were like trying to, they call it like, they're stealing hashtags. So they're doing a counter campaign by taking the hashtag of the military, but using it in a negative way to attack the military. And actually that one went viral. So, so one of the things we wanted to understand was, why were they doing this? I mean, the motivation seemed obvious, but it's still important to really understand it, right? So we look at all the tweets, especially the ones that get a lot of engagement, which there weren't many of. So we analyzed the different hashtag campaigns, and it became clear that the few key things that they like to do was, number one, it was used very much to target political opposition, especially the new political parties that emerged that were very popular among young people. Second, it was used to neutralize anti-military sentiment whenever there was a problem with the military. So there was a shooting, mass shooting in Thailand, the one that actually happened before the recent one, involved a military officer, an army officer, and there was so much negativity against the army as a backlash. And they specifically used the disinformation campaign to try to neutralize the situation and talk about all the great things the military has done for the country, what have you. We also looked at who the key players were in the disinformation campaign, and it was very clear that it came from the main official accounts of a few core military units that are in Bangkok and surrounding Bangkok. So the command center of this disinformation campaign came out of particular army bases in Bangkok. We look at the percent of tweets that represent. We also look at the key topics that this disinformation campaign was targeting, and we found that much of it concentrated on attacking the political opposition, the official Fourth Party, which has been disbanded, anti-government flash mobs at the time the youth protesters were taking off. So they were used to target the protesters, but they were also used to promote the monarchy with the barge procession and neutralize bad when the military got bad press, like when there was a shooting. But while looking at these tweets, I also found that about 1% of the tweets were sabotaging the military. And I suspect, given the leak that happened a year before, that basically the military boss basically just used low-ranking soldiers to do IOs. Every day they get a spreadsheet and said, you're in charge of these 8 accounts. These are the things you have to say. And they all said exactly the same thing across these nearly 1,000 accounts. I could see some of the sabotage going on. Basically, probably some of these soldiers hated doing this and start saying bad stuff about the military, but because there weren't that many of them, it went unnoticed. But I saw them and I thought, oh wow, that's such a clever way to sabotage your own institution, to kind of like, imagine like you're being recruited to join the army and your job is to like say great stuff about the military on Facebook or Twitter. Like, this is not what they thought they signed up for if they were thinking of defending the nation, like they became internet trolls. Like, this is ridiculous. So there's a lot of discontent with this. So that was the project that we wrapped up. Basically, we gave our analysis to Twitter. Twitter made an announcement they were taking down 926 accounts and put our report there as an independent investigation into that. And wow, I was trolled for a year on Twitter. This is the price you pay. Actually, they asked me, do you want to put your name on it? You're the only Thai person. You know that this can go really badly for you. I said, yeah, I do know, because I basically saying that the military is behind this information campaign and they did a bad job at it. It's like nothing worse than like making the institution like the military lose face, right? Like, by the way, your IO sucked, right? And I said, well, so I decided to put my name on it because I thought every once in a while as an academic, I should do something brave. So I did. Then there was a massive media, a storm after that, like every single station, TV, whatever. And then the good thing that came out was like, I got called to talk about this report in the parliament in Thailand, to talk about, the issue of disinformation campaigns against political parties, and subsequently they created a subcommittee on disinformation in politics in Thailand, and trying to sort of, get to the bottom of it. But it's an authoritarian regime, so there wasn't much one can do. But I think just having a tech company come out and explicitly say, this happened. It's not fake news. We believe there was a concerted effort by the Thai state to mislead their own people in a very coordinated way, and that came out of the army. And then look at why they did it and who they targeted, and then to be able to have some new avenue to discuss this, which is the subcommittee that was created. I think for a country like Thailand, I think that's progress, even if the same people are still in power, because it just feeds into more evidence, about why the situation isn't so good, the kind of cyber surveillance that happened. So that was, I thought, if I had to look back in my short academic career, that was probably the most impactful thing I've ever done. And I did pay the price for the consequence of being part of that as a Thai national. But it's something that I'm really proud of, that I have been part of. So that's it for the Twitter portion of the presentation. Is there any question before I move on to hate speech?
Aim, I don't have a question, but just having a look at the time.
Yeah.
It's so maybe if you could on this second portion of your talk, maybe and wrap it up in next 10-15 minutes or so, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the other project was funded by Facebook. It was a collaboration between Sydney and Queensland University. And we basically were looking at hate speech in the Asia Pacific on Facebook platform. And of all of the content that they had to deal with, hate speech is the most difficult for them to manage, because hate speech is difficult to define. In fact, there is no agreement about what hate speech is. So we thought our job was to look at 5 countries. In Asia, so we look at India, Australia, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Myanmar. And we particularly zero in on the LGBTQ communities, because we thought if any group is likely to get a lot of hate speech online, it will be them. And our approach to understanding hate speech is in 2 ways. One is we look at the definition that the platform uses, which is in the content policy of Facebook. And then we try to match that to existing legislature or institutions in these 5 countries. And then we interview Facebook staff to try to better understand how they manage hate speech content. And then we look at the 3 most popular LGBTQ groups on Facebook across 5 countries. So that's 15 groups, where we analyze all of their data in 2019 and then interview all the admins of their groups to ask about hate speech. And the important things to mention when you're studying content on a platform like Facebook is that whatever you see online is what's left there. So that means it has escaped the hate speech algorithms. It shows up. It hasn't yet been removed by either Facebook or the web admin. So it's whatever we see, right? It's a biased sample of data that we see. So it's important to triangulate that with other methods to enhance our understanding of the content. So that's where the interviews come from. And that's where, understanding, talking to Facebook staff also help us. So I'm just not going to go through this, but what we did find was that we were speculating or hypothesizing about which country would see the most hate speech against LGBTQ groups. And initially, we thought it would be Myanmar, given what had happened with the Rohingya and the Muslim minorities. But it turns out, and Mark will be not surprised at all, that the worst case of hate speech is in the Philippines. And that's our findings conclude that we believe that hate speech content thrives when there is politicization of the issue. So the more the issue is politicized, the more hate speech you see. We thought a highly toxic online environment like Myanmar would see all kinds of hate speech proliferate, but we found that to be incorrect. And we found that the LGBTQ groups in Myanmar, which I don't even know, this is Indonesia, was experiencing a pretty low, actually, in fact, they had not seen any hate speech, and they had been growing exponentially in terms of popularity and their outreach, even though it's a very difficult place for LGBTQ groups to thrive because it's a very conservative, socially place, you know, it's not like Thailand. Even Thailand is a conservative place. But the interviews have informed us that because all the hate was going to the Muslims, it actually helped other minority groups to thrive, that we didn't expect to see hate speech being kind of segmented and siloed that way. Like we thought, well, given so much disinformation and fake news and all this bad content going on in Myanmar and very little help from tech companies trying to filter that out, that all of the minority groups would be affected. But in fact, we found that no, not at all, that because the issue of LGBTQ was not politicized in Myanmar, no one was talking about them in some way, and that was so surprising. So the Philippines had been dealing with the Soji bill, which were trying to pass to give more rights to LGBTQ groups. And that's why it was the only country, and to a lesser extent Indonesia, that had really seen the issue of hate speech against LGBTQ groups being talked about by politicians, especially opposition politicians, like, I'm forgetting her name, Hermanosa, is there one? Mark, anyway, I'll come back to the name. And so we basically, our findings is that we could still see content that violate Facebook policy against hate speech online, which means that our algorithm isn't as good as picking up content, even in English. This is the case of India. So they're talking about, you know, throwing, you know, killing gay people, stoning them to death, that kind of very outright violence. We also find that the most important gatekeepers against hate speech is actually the admins of groups. And we argue at the end that this is the people you need to empower if you want to fight against bad content like hate speech. We also find with our interviews that none of the page admins, group admins, actually understand hate speech. They don't really know what it is because the word hate speech is a Western term. And in most countries, they don't even have a proper word for it. It's a new term that has basically been translated from English. There had been no training of page admins or group admins about actual content policy of Facebook, what does hate speech look like in their own language. And we recommend to Facebook that it's a very cheap and easy thing to do to provide online training in as many languages as they can, and even perhaps, you know, live training sessions where you empower the very people who are at the front line of hate which is and disinformation and all types of bad content like extremist radical content, which are basically the group admins who in most cases in the Asia Pacific are basically volunteers. It's not a job that they get paid to do. This is why we had Australia as a counter case to look at, because in Australia, community managers are actually professionals. They get paid, they get lots of training, and that's why there's so little hate speech against LGBTQ groups on Australian pages, because the admins are removing them. They are actually at the front line fighting away bad content that had escaped Facebook algorithms. So I'll just stop sharing. So just to conclude, looking at the issue of disinformation and the issue of hate speech, two types of content that is extremely challenging to study, but also to counter. What did I learn through this process? The first lesson is social media companies have a very different understanding of both disinformation and hate speech than the people, the ordinary users. From the tech company's perspective, it's really about how to manage it in a global scale and not necessarily about how that kind of content affects people. So if you get people to read hateful things on Facebook and they say, well, I'm hurt by reading it. A lot of the time that doesn't even meet the definition of hate speech set out by a tech company, because they have to set out definitions that are operational for them at a global scale. They can't deal with case-by-case basis. They get like 10 million updates a second. They can't do solutions that would please you and and not a lot of people, so they can't do that. Secondly, I find that there are a lot of people who could be empowered to help fight against bad content that are not being empowered right now. I give an example of group admins, page admins, influencers actually could really help if there is a concerted effort by tech companies to actually train them and kind of recruit them to help them fight against bad content. And third, it's extremely difficult to study and research these type of things. And one important progress researchers can make is to demand for data access. And I'm happy to say that in the 7 years I've started working in a social media company with social media data, that things are becoming a bit easier now than it has ever been. Thanks largely to lobbying of academics trying to gain and civil society trying to gain access to social media data to be able to study disinformation, hate speech, misinformation, and all these things. So I think this is a good time to be studying these issues. We're still trying to figure out what's going on half the time, but yeah, it's a really interesting and fascinating active areas of research. So end my talk there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aim, for that fascinating talk. Also, the fact that you personally were involved in taking on trolls and negative reactions and sticking your neck out as an academic, very admirable. Academics are not known as a necessarily very brave lot, so thanks for being an exception in that regard. While we're going to have an open forum now. People can send the questions, please, to the chat. While people are formulating their thoughts, I thought maybe one way to kick things off is you ended with a list of kind of takeaways. Here's my list for you. See what you think. First takeaway was social media companies aren't as bad as we thought they are. They're a little bit more open-minded, particularly when you confront them with some solid empirical work. They're open to suggestions, or open to cooperation. That was kind of a surprise that I don't think is quite well understood, and you kind of ended on a positive message that this means that the prospects of further study are actually have improved. The second takeaway was governments engage in disinformation, but they're not that good at it. That was fascinating, because you kind of think of Big Brother and Orwell and in charge of things, but maybe all governments have different capabilities. But that was a fascinating thing. And the third was that hate speech is not necessarily a good reflection of where a society is at, because in a sense, if you think about the Philippine case, it's progressive because it's dealing at least with LGBTQ issues. It's debating them. It's trying to legislate, considering legislation, but that generates hate speech. So hate speech is not, it's not, as you said, it might be logical if societies are very conservative and they're notorious for targeting minority groups. But in a sense, as you said, if it becomes an issue for a good reason, even like, legislation, that can become hate speech. So that was kind of a surprise as well. I just throw that out as 3 observations.
Thank you. That was great observation. You said better than me.
Do we have any further comments? Let me check the chat. Do we have any chat messages?
Mark, can I follow up on?
Yeah, go ahead.
You just mentioned, and this whole idea that we see here an authoritarian government who doesn't seem to be that good at disseminating this kind of misleading information. Usually, we think of Thailand as a pretty authoritarian country, as a government that is quite effective at repression. And more generally, also like, beyond Thailand, we often think of authoritarianism as getting more and more sophisticated, as these repressive governments as getting better and better at using the information to repress dissent or to manufacture certain information. So the case you have presented is, I don't know if it's consoling, but at least it's a little bit surprising. So I was just wondering if, since you conducted these studies, have you seen any trends, any any developments in terms of like perhaps the Thai government like learning from previous mistakes and getting a little bit more tech savvy, so to speak?
I get that a lot. Like, yeah, I think also you in Hong Kong, right? You're dealing with a different type of authoritarian government, probably the most sophisticated one. So yeah, Twitter campaign, it's just part of many, like many ways in which you've done work on this, Diego, like the different innovations. Actually, it's not really even innovation in Thailand because they've been doing information ops since before the internet, but there are many ways to repress people or to manipulate. And the Twitter example is just showing when they go into a new territory, they don't understand, right? They're like going to Twitter just because that's where young people are, but they don't really understand the terrain very well in the military language. But in other areas, on the other hand, like actual repression or like, using Israeli surveillance software to hack into activist Apple phones, right? Thailand is one of the biggest clients of China's AI software. And so they may not be very good on their own, but they will buy and procure technologies that would help them to get better at it. And I think what COVID has taught Thailand was that, I think it's a lesson for many countries. In times of crisis, people are really willing to forego their civil liberties and privacy, You think the tolerance line for government intrusion was here, and then COVID happened and it's like significantly drop. Even in the midst of people protesting, still there's this, it's almost like on the one hand they're willing to be surveyed and tagged by their governments for all kinds of public health reason, but on the other hand, they're like fighting the government for the same reason, but in a different way, like, you know. And I feel like they've definitely gotten better at this, but not the digital culture part. I think that's going to take time, because doing digital repression is multifaceted, and it's not just about, you know, buying technology to help you monitor, but it's really about if your long-term gain is propaganda, it's manipulating people's minds and understanding of the world, that is something that needs more sophistication. But if it's just about, you know, targeting certain activists, trying to remove, you know, individualized threats or targeted threats, they can do that. They've done it. They've always done it. But to kind of get the societal buy-in to prop them up as a legitimate government or a legitimate institution, that's a long-term game that I think needs to encompass understanding of the highly dynamic and evolving digital culture. And that's an important lesson for authoritarian regimes, I think, anywhere, is you have to speak the language of the people you're trying to convince. Otherwise, you're just talking at them. Yeah. You're never gonna understand. So they have to rely on more traditional form of repression to get basic coercion, right? They want compliance and understanding and sympathy. It has to be matched by better and more nuanced understanding of digital culture, in my view.
Thanks.
And we have one question on chat, and you may be able to see it yourself. I'll read it. How do you define hate speech in a highly polarized society like Thailand? I joined a Facebook group, which is on Twitter, entitled, and then you'll do the translation, on Royalist Marketplace. Actually, the translation is here. And I found it interesting that some royalists also define it as hate speech. I guess the point is, in a polarized society, hate speech can become, you know, what the other side says, as it were. And that's difficult.
Yeah. I strongly encourage you to actually read the content policy on hate speech that's produced by Facebook. And when you read that, you realize how much that concept is based on America. It's a very American-centric understanding of everything, really. And I've argued elsewhere that this is actually a good thing, because it's so liberal and so progressive compared to how many countries understand hate speech in Asia, right? In Southeast Asia in particular. Hate speech is not about whether or not you read something and it makes you feel hurtful. It's not. Hate speech is actually a very specific type of speech that is used to discriminate or disparage or make inferior minority groups in society. And Facebook laid out who are the protected minority groups are in society. And that's based pretty much on America, right? Which includes, you know, racial minority, immigrants group, which you ask some, you know, when we interview some countries, like, who's your racial minority? And they're like, what racial minority? They don't never know what that is, because it's not, you know, ethnic minority, religious minority, sexual minority, gender minority. Just go down the list. There's a very long list. When I started the research, the list is very short. It keeps getting added on because of all the lobbying done out of America and out of Europe, basically, the pushing Facebook to keep expanding the protected minority groups under hate speech content moderation. So that's the thing, right? You ask people like, oh, that has to be hate speech. What this guy say on Royalist Marketplace is so offensive. But then the question is, offensive to who? If it's offensive to a group who are protected minorities in the country, which then we have to start defining who these groups are in Thailand. Then you have a case to try to get Facebook to remove it. But other than that, you don't, right? And it is very quite specific way of speech. It's degrading, dehumanizing, make inferior groups of people, and not just you, because that's just individual. They don't deal with individuals, they deal with groups, because they care about content that can affect lots and lots of people. So I think there's lots of offensive language going on social media everywhere. That doesn't mean it's hate speech. So I would strongly encourage you to look at a hate speech definition that the tech companies use. And I think the one that Facebook uses is quite progressive, because it's quite similar to what hate speech scholars have studied. And then try to put that on a Thai context, right? Where people don't really actually understand like who are the protected minority groups are. And then you start to see the problem. The other thing I'd like to mention is that in 2019, this is the latest data I have, and I have to update with Facebook. The algorithms they use to detect hate speech only covers 57 languages. How many languages are there in Asia? Thousands. Visaya, spoken in the Philippines as a minority language, is spoken by 16 million people. So I did a different study where I look at the accuracy of the Tagalog algorithm and Visaya algorithm to detect a same content on hate speech. And the one on Visaya is so much less accurate. So in fact, all tech companies, including Google, is struggling to have algorithms in as many languages as possible. And they're just trying to focus on a national language, not the sub-national language. And you know, when people talk on social media, they type the way they talk. So in Philippines, they could be using English, Tagalog, and Visaya all in one text, in one post. And the algorithm is struggling with what they call code switching, which is using all these multiple languages, let alone just three. There is not a single algorithm that are detecting any languages in the South Pacific, with the exception of the one in Papua New Guinea that's just starting, because there's just not enough people speaking those languages. They call them low frequency languages. So to build an algorithm, you need enough data, like a lot of it, to build one. And so if you are speaking a language that is not spoken by a lot of people, and there aren't many people speaking it, everything goes. There's no filtering at all going on. In fact, that's what the public policy manager told me in the Sydney office. We have not monitored anything at all in the entire South Pacific. We know we should. I'm working with Google right now, and they are saying they're behind Facebook on that. Imagine what's going on YouTube comments if you read anything recently. Their algorithms only covering 100 languages so far. They're trying, but so this is something to keep in mind when you're thinking about trying to monitor content in places like Southeast Asia, where lots of minority languages are spoken by lots of people.
Aim, if before another chat question comes up, maybe a chance to follow up on that. So your idea about kind of this decentralized gatekeeping through group administrators. Is there any reason why social media companies are resisting that, or is that something that they're thinking about? Or I mean, are they reluctant to give up that power? Are they worried that these group administrators will abuse that power? What are some of the power issues there?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a really great question. So before COVID, we were interviewing a lot of staff at the Singapore office, which is the headquarters for the entire Asia Pacific. And they were going down a path of decentralization because they realized that they're struggling to deal with everything in Asia. So they said, okay, we need more staff in the Singapore office. We need to hire more people who speak a lot of Southeast Asian languages we don't cover right now. They don't have staff in Vietnam. They don't have staff in Myanmar because of security reason. They're flying in and out their staff out of the Singapore office to go check on Myanmar every week or every 2 weeks. Like the whole genocide was going down, right? And they have no staff there because of security reason. Their staff is working on the border in Bangladesh, trying to get intel from the military about what's going on in Rakhine State. It's just, they realize that they need to hire more staff. They need to not use subcontractors to do content moderation as much as they rely on, right? They need to actually have them as employees, so they have benefits, so they stay. It's a tough job. Then COVID happened. And so at that point, they were thinking of moving towards a model of 70% robots and 30% human in terms of content moderation. And then COVID happened, they went back to 90 to 10. They end up relying more on robots, 90%, and then human moderators, only 10. I know they're slowly getting back there. They hired the first person in the entire South Pacific in charge of Papua New Guinea, which is probably seen the worst case of hate speech other than Myanmar. I mean, 1 in 7 women there get raped, and a lot of it's now being fueled by social media. So yeah, I think that broadly speaking, they're not opposed to the idea. It's just one of the many things they have to do. I recommended that they offer online courses in as many languages as they can, and give them, like, people who take the course, give them badges that they can use on their CV as something professional that they can leverage for their career. You know, these are people who do it on their for free. They have, as you know, Southeast Asian, they have like a million jobs, and then they're in charge of a social media page for an organization, and then they're selling stuff on Facebook, and then they're, you know, so like if you can give them something in their language that they can then put on their resume, that's a really good way. You don't have to do it, you know, and then frequently do get in touch with, you know, doing monthly webinars or training or something like that. Because up until now, it's been mostly in English, and you know, there's the selection going on, right? People who can speak English, you know, they're much more in touch with what's going on. So I don't, they're not opposed to the idea. It's just like they have so many things to do. It's just a priority, because you know, tech companies like Facebook, the public policy people, which is our people in charge of content, it's not the most important people, right? The most important people are engineers. So their internal politics is just fighting with the engineers to make them realize that what they're doing is important. So I can see that internal politics is talking to them. And also with Google, the same thing. You know, you basically have to convince their boss that a new initiative is worth doing, and that they need to give them engineers to help them with that. And that comes at a cost, because what they're doing is pro bono and they're not making money. And so the internal politics goes.
Thanks very much. I no longer have access for some reason to the chat function, but Calvin or Aim, perhaps you can see if there are any other chats. I
don't see other questions now, Mark.
Okay, good. Well, in that case, Aim, then all that remains on my side is to again express our gratitude for this absolutely fascinating talk. I think it's fair to say we all learned a lot. You know, it's all of our talks here are interesting and so on, but I can't remember a talk in some time where I was so surprised by some of the conclusions that you came up with. And the fascinating thing was to see how you also were surprised, which is a great advocacy for the scientific method, right? You go in and you discover things that you don't expect. And
you're constantly wrong about your assumptions.
That's the humbling effect of the scientific method.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Keep up the good work. And again, thanks for sharing your thoughts with us, spending time. We look forward to hearing more and reading more about your research in the near future. Thanks everybody for joining. Thanks,
Thank
everybody, for
you.
joining. And if for those who are still there, let me say that we have our next talk on the 21st of November, the dynamics of state and society, formal and informal, urban and rural, at the Peri-Urban Hanoi. In other words, a urban studies talk by a specialist on Vietnam, Tran Huy An, associate professor at the Department of Urban Studies in Malmo, in Sweden, Malmo University. So on the 21st, that will be on our website. Please join us for that as well. Thanks again, AIM, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aim. Thanks a lot.
Bye, Diego.
Pleasure to have you.